What was life just before the fall of Berlin like? The tides of World War II started to turn against Germany in 1942, but it was the amphibious invasion of Normandy in 1944 that finally secured victory for the Allies. From that moment and until the final battle in Berlin in May 1945, the Germans were slowly driven from their decimated positions and forced to fight, being pushed further west until they stood fighting in the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin. But Hitler, still obsessed with the belief that fanatical aggression could hold back the enemy, tried to pour the last of his resources into the battle in a fanatical attempt to win time. A struggling German army tried in vain to avoid being sucked into a maelstrom of destruction. From the harrowing tales of life in war-torn Berlin under the relentless bombardment of the Russians, to the final desperate combats in the streets of the German capital, we will explore the horrendous story of an army's desperate attempt to save the crumbling Third Reich. Living in doomed Berlin in 1945. By the end of 1944, German cities and towns were mostly populated by women and children, as the men were affected to the war effort in the front lines or were already dead by then. By the time combat broke in the streets of Berlin in April 1945, an estimated 1.5 million women and girls lived in the city. Many had lost their homes to the ceaseless bombing of Soviet mortar and their husbands to the battlefront. There was food and water shortage, and basic services were all but cut. To add to their suffering, experts have calculated that 1 in 3 of these women suffered some kind of sexual assault at the end of the World War II. Many of them met the perpetrators face-to-face during the week of April 24th to May 5th, 1945, when the Soviets surrounded the city of Berlin, killing the last traces of a Nazi resistance. Only a few days before the iconic photograph of the Soviet flag flying atop the Reichstag was taken, many women suffered at the hands of these so-called heroes. The Battle of Berlin was bloody and cruel, not only because it really was the last stand of the Nazis, who had nothing more to lose, but also because it consisted mostly of close-quarter combat, and the fighting troops were severely unprepared. These were not the elite troops of the Waffen-SS. The defense of Berlin was left to General Helmuth Weidling's mostly depleted and disorganized reserve division. Moreover, General Weidling's garrison consisted almost entirely of elderly men of the national militia and kids from the Hitler Youth, including little girls with no fighting experience. They had to fight starved and vicious Soviet troops who were eager to finally end hostilities. The official casualties of the Battle of Berlin were more than 900,000 Germans and 360,000 Polish and Soviet. The number of abused women varies according to the source, going from 20,000 to 100,000, up to almost 1 million. But long before the arrival of the Soviets, air raids were a common occurrence, and the citizens of Berlin got used to running for cover when they heard the sirens wailing. Despite all of this, Hitler and his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, would constantly tell the population that the situation was under control and that Germany's final victory in World War II was just a matter of weeks. Berliners were, of course, mostly aware of the government lies by the end of 1944. There was a pervasive atmosphere of impending downfall in personal lives as much as in the nation's existence. People spent their money recklessly, assuming that it would soon be worthless or that they would not be alive long, so saving it was pointless. Girls and young women would have sex with strangers in dark corners around the zoo station and in the Tiergarten. In Nazi bunkers over the city too, parties were held where everyone drank and celebrated as if there was no tomorrow. For most of the supporters of the Nazi Party, this was the harsh truth. The desire to dispense with innocence is said to have become even more desperate later as the Red Army approached Berlin. The air raid shelters themselves, lit with blue lights, could be very claustrophobic as people rushed in carrying small suitcases where they stored sandwiches and thermos. The government claimed that all basic needs were catered for in the shelters. There was a small medical room with a nurse where women could go into labor. Childbirth reportedly was accelerated by the vibrations from bomb explosions, which felt very close. The ceilings were painted with luminous paint because electrical failures were common during air raids. Water supplies stopped when main pipes were hit by bombs, and the lavatories soon became disgusting. Germans were usually very preoccupied with hygiene, But during this difficult period, they mostly abandoned their standards. They were more worried about staying alive. Survivors later testified that whenever they opened the doors of the lavatories, they were afraid that they would find the corpses of depressed people who took their own lives. For a population of around 3 million, Berlin did not have enough shelters, so they were usually overcrowded. In the main corridors, seating halls and bunk rooms, the air was foul from overuse and condensation dripped from the ceilings. Candles were used to measure the diminishing levels of oxygen. When a candle placed on the floor went out, children were picked up and held at shoulder height. When a candle on a chair went out, then the evacuation of the level began. And if a third candle, positioned at about chin level, began to sputter, then the whole bunker was evacuated, even when they were still under attack by bomber planes. Amazingly, some Berliners tried to continue working as if nothing happened, for fear that they would lose their minds if they were idle enough time. There was little work to do in their offices and factories, owing to shortages of raw materials and parts, but they still set out on foot through the rubble or on public transport. Once again, miracles had been achieved repairing the subway and tramway tracks, even though few of the carriages had unbroken windows. Factories and offices were also freezing due to smashed windows and so little fuel for heating. Those with colds or flu had to struggle on. There was no point attempting to see a doctor unless they were seriously ill. Almost all the German doctors had been sent to the army. The whole of Berlin was a doomed city. A threatened Reich, the eastern and western fronts crumble. With the collapse of the so-called Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the Allies disembarking in Normandy in D-Day, the borders of Nazi Germany were threatened from the east and from the west. And not only that, in June 1944, an Allied army dealt a serious blow to the power of the Nazis by liberating Rome, which meant the southern end of the Third Reich was now also unprotected. The Allies were now confident that winning the war was a matter of time, and organized a reunion to decide what would happen to all the territories controlled by Hitler after the war. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt arrived in Yalta, in the Crimea, to meet Joseph Stalin, their Soviet counterpart. Their reunion took place in February 1945. They were all housed in all Tsarist palaces and given caviar and champagne while they discussed the plans for Europe after World War II ended. In the meantime, the people at Berlin were growing increasingly worried about all the armies that were slowly advancing towards the city. Berlin lies in northeast Germany, close to the borders with Poland, which since 1939 was firmly in the hands of the Nazis. Now, Poland was crumbling, and the Red Army was making progress, first across the Vistula River and then the Oder, which today marks the eastern border of Germany. Joseph Goebbels, through his propaganda ministry, had been feeding the public stories about the depravities of Russian soldiers for years. The women were terrified of what would become of them if the Russians reached Berlin. Unfortunately, soon enough they would find out for themselves. Many women were simply not prepared for the shock of Russian revenge, however much propaganda they had heard. Everyone was aware of the German claims that Soviets were pigs and prone to sexually assaulting women, but nobody suspected that they could do it in such an open way and in a large scale as they did in Berlin. On the other hand, the British and Americans had a reputation of hating Germans to death, so they knew nobody was safe, and it was impossible not to be concerned about the disturbing news of the war. On 13th February, 2 days after the Yalta Conference ended, Soviet power was reconfirmed with the fall of Budapest, which was until then in the hands of Nazis. The end of this terrible battle for the city was marked by an orgy of killing, looting, destruction, and sexual assault. Yet Hitler still wanted to counterattack in Hungary with the 6th SS Panzer Army. That night, the British bombed Dresden. The following morning, the United States Air Force also attacked several lesser targets. This attack had been accorded in Yalta, as Stalin made Churchill and Roosevelt promise him that they would hinder German troop movements by smashing rail communications. At the same time, Hitler launched 180 V-bomb rocket attacks on England, the highest number so far. The Allied counterattack was ruthless. Dresden, the exquisitely beautiful capital of Saxony, had never been seriously bombed before. But the raids on the 13th and 14th of February were merciless. Dresden's population was swollen by up to 300,000 refugees from the east. Several trains full of them were stuck in the main station. Goebbels shook with fury on hearing the news. He made a promise to execute as many prisoners of war as the number of civilians killed in the attack. The idea appealed to Hitler, but General Jodl, supported by Ribbentrop, Field Marshal Keitel and Grand Admiral Dönitz, finally persuaded him that such an escalation of terror would turn out worse for Germany. On the Western Front, the Americans and the British had not been advancing anything like as rapidly as the Red Army. The battle for the Rhineland, which began during the talks at Yalta, was also slow and deliberate. Eisenhower was in no hurry. He thought that spring floodwater would make the Rhine impassable until the beginning of May. It would take another 6 weeks before all Eisenhower's armies were ready on the west bank of the Rhine. This campaign was accelerated because the Allies managed to capture an intact bridge over the Rhine in the town of Remagen. The people at Berlin learned with horror that the most important rivers in Germany had been crossed by the Allied armies in the west and in the east. Waiting for the inevitable fall of Berlin. During early April of 1945, as Berlin awaited the final Soviet onslaught along the Oder, the atmosphere in the city became a mixture of febrile exhaustion, terrible foreboding and despair. While most people were aware of the impending defeat, fanatical determination still existed among many young Nazis. Goebbels had distributed a message from Hitler himself, warning the people in German cities that those who did not fight until the bitter end would be executed by the SS. Also, Goebbels tried to convince the population that the Allied themselves would execute anyone who surrendered to them. The Nazi fanatics, like Hitler, were determined to ensure that everyone else shared the same fate as themselves. In September 1944, when the Western Allies and the Red Army had been advancing towards the Reich with great speed, the Nazi leadership wanted to fight on against its sworn enemies even after defeat. It decided to set up a resistance movement to be known by the codename Werewolf. It would be an elite and secret force designed for partisan resistance and assassinations. Members of Werewolf would target and kill key enemy figures and sabotage enemy facilities by means of concealed explosives and weapons. A whole range of items and even garments made of Nippolit explosive were designed, including raincoats with linings made of explosive. Werewolf recruits were taught to kill sentries with a slip-knotted garrote about 1 meter long or a Walter pistol with silencer. They were to operate in groups of 3 to 6 men and were to receive rations for 60 days. Special emphasis was put on gasoline and oil supplies as targets. The Nazi authorities ordered 2,000 radios and 5,000 explosive kits, but few were ready in time. American incendiary bombs dropped in bombing raids were collected, and concentration camp inmates were forced to check them and extract the material for reuse. Hitler Youth boys were sent off to their selected areas, where they were told to bury their explosive, then contact the local Nazi leaders for accommodation and rations. They were all given single, unspecified missions, then told to go home as if nothing had happened. Towards the end, the training became very hurried. So many of them were more likely to blow themselves up rather than the enemy. Ultimately, Werewolf achieved very little, apart from a couple of assassinations like the mayors of Aachen and Krankenhagen. But they succeeded in the intimidation of civilians. Fighting in the streets of Berlin was a completely different matter. Despite Hitler's stern orders, all of his plans were far from reality, as Berlin did not have an organized military defense force, and no SS general was formally in charge of the defense. Those who were detached to the city had to manage with very few resources and could expect no help from outside. Furthermore, Heinrich Himmler had ordered SS troops to execute anyone even remotely suspected of cowardice. 10,000 Germans were killed on the streets of Berlin during the resistance period, because they rejected their orders of fighting to death. There was no choice for most of the Germans. They would be killed either by the enemy or their own comrades. Goebbels, as Reich Commissioner for Berlin, had ordered that no man capable of bearing arms may leave Berlin. Only the headquarters for the defense of Berlin could issue an exemption. Berlin's population in early April stood at anything between 3 and 3.5 million people, including around 120,000 infants. Feeding all those people was almost impossible under the circumstances. General Helmuth Reimann, tasked with the suicidal task of defending Berlin from the Soviets, brought this problem to Hitler, but he did not offer any solutions. Joseph Goebbels ensured him that there were ample reserves of tinned milk. but if that failed, they could bring cows to the center of Berlin to milk them. What Goebbels did not say was how the cows would be fed. The Nazi Party in Berlin talked of mobilizing armies of civilians to work on defenses, forming a so-called obstacle ring 30 kilometers out of the city, as well as a perimeter ring. But the maximum workforce ever achieved on one day was 70,000. It was usually no more than 30,000. Transport and a shortage of tools were the main problems, apart from the fact that most Berlin factories and offices continued to work as if nothing happened. Instead of German workers, 17,000 French prisoners of war were put to work in the city, creating barricades and digging foxholes in pavements at street corners. Some of them took the opportunity to flee, and some were killed in the process. The fall of Berlin was inevitable. On the evening of the 12th of April, the Berlin Philharmonic gave its last performance. It was organized by Albert Speer, and Grand Admiral Dönitz was invited. The hall was properly lit for the occasion, despite the electricity cuts. The program included Beethoven's Violin Concerto, Bruckner's Eighth Symphony, and the finale to Wagner's Götterdämmerung. It was reported that after the performance, the Nazi Party had organized Hitler Youth members to stand in uniform with baskets of cyanide capsules and offer them to members of the audience as they left. Many of them would later probably use them when the Soviets finally broke the little defenses and invaded the city. The Führer's last birthday. Friday the 20th of April 1945 was Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. At this point, while he remained underground in his bunker, some fanatics still raised Nazi flags on the ruined buildings and put up posters on the desolate streets, celebrating their leader's birthday. But for most people, there were little reasons to celebrate. 6 years earlier, Professor Dr. Lutz Heck of the Berlin Zoological Garden had sent the Führer an exotic present, an ostrich egg weighing 1,230 grams to make scrambled eggs. But in 1945, there were very few letters and parcels, and not just because the postal system had collapsed. The Berlin Zoo was also half destroyed, with many of the animals starving. American and British bomber forces were well aware of the date. Sirens sounded in the morning as massed squadrons approached to greet the Führer's birthday with a particularly heavy raid. Bombs and artillery fire rained on the buildings of central Berlin. It was expected that only the most loyal in Hitler's inner circle would attend his party in the bunker. Hermann Göring, the creator of the Gestapo, had woken that morning at Karinhall, his country house north of Berlin, thanks to the bombs of the Russian offensive. A convoy of Luftwaffe trucks was outside his home, loaded with his looted treasures. A motorcycle detachment would escort them south. The engineer officer had laid explosives to blow up Karinhall, but Göring himself pushed the button to blow the place up. The explosion blasted vast clouds of dust outwards. Then Göring walked to his enormous limousine to be driven to Berlin. He needed to be at the Reich Chancellery at noon to congratulate the Führer on his birthday. Joseph Goebbels, the only leading Nazi planning to stay in Berlin with Hitler until the bitter end, broadcast a birthday speech that morning. He called on all Germans to trust blindly in the Führer, who would lead them out of their difficulties. It is unknown how many people listened to this message or how many of them believed it. By that time, it was evident that everything was lost and that it would be the Führer's last birthday. Many of the celebrants offering their birthday wishes that day thought that Hitler looked at least 20 years older than he was. They urged their leader to take the road to Bavaria while there was still time. Hitler stated with conviction that the Russians were about to suffer their bloodiest defeat before Berlin. Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had ordered to take command in the north of Germany, received an affectionate farewell. But Göring, who claimed that he would organize resistance in Bavaria, was treated in a distant manner. Hitler felt disappointed by the cowardice of Göring and the others. He was in denial of reality and blamed his generals for not having faith in the final victory. He had always persuaded himself that his close followers were men of courage. During the situation conference that day, the main question was how soon the Allies would reach Berlin. The territory still unoccupied was diminishing every day. The British were on the Lüneburg Heath, heading towards Hamburg. The Americans were on the Middle Elbe, on the borders of Czechoslovakia and moving into Bavaria. The French First Army was advancing into southern Germany. To the southeast, the Red Army was west of Vienna, and the Allies in Italy were moving north across the Po Valley. Again, the subject of the Nazi hierarchy abandoning Berlin came up. To the surprise of nearly everyone present, Hitler announced that he would stay in Berlin until the last minute and only then fly to the south. His entourage was surprised but respected his decision. After the meeting, the rest of the leadership began to invent all manner of excuses to leave Berlin on official business. Himmler, Ribbentrop and Kaltenbrunner departed in different directions. A number of the Reich Chancellery staff were detailed to leave for the Berghof the next day. That afternoon, in the ruined Reich Chancellery garden, the Führer examined a line of Hitler youth, some of whom had received the Iron Cross for attacking Soviet tanks. Hitler could not present any medals himself because his left arm was shaking all the time. He congratulated the little soldiers on their bravery and asked them to keep defending the Reich. Then he retired until the evening, when he was expected to celebrate with his close associates. After receiving members of the close entourage that evening in the tiny sitting room in the bunker, Hitler retired to bed much earlier than usual. Eva Braun led the others up to the Reich Chancellery, where they drank champagne and listened to the only record they had available. The next morning, the ordinary women of Berlin emerged to queue for food after the air raid. The sound of artillery fire in the distance confirmed their fears that this might be their last chance to stock up. The desperation for news meant that a small crowd of people were already waiting at the kiosk when the paperboy arrived. Newspapers were now no more than a single piece printed on both sides, and they contained far more propaganda than information. The only useful section was the Wehrmacht Daily Communiqué, which, despite its evasive circumlocutions, indicated by the towns it cited how far the enemy had advanced. The mention of Müncheberg that day, on the Seelow Heights, roughly 17 kilometers west of downtown Berlin, meant that the Russians had definitely broken through. Crossing the Oder, the final battle before taking Berlin. The final battle before Berlin began at dawn on the 16th of April 1945. Just 20 kilometers east of the German capital above the swollen river Oder, red flares burst into the night sky, triggering a massive artillery barrage. For nearly an hour, an eruption of flame and smoke burst along the German front. Then, in the mud, smoke and darkness, the avalanche broke. In an instant, Soviet General Zhukov's soldiers were compelled to stumble forward into action. As they surged forward, the artillery barrage remained in front of them, covering the area ahead. Under the cover of darkness, on the night of the 15th, most German forward units had been moved back to a second line just before the expected Russian artillery barrage. Here, in this defensive line, troops dug in deeply. When the Soviet forces finally attacked during the early morning of 16th April, the Germans were ready to meet them on the Seelow Heights. From the top of the ridge, hundreds of German flak guns that had been hastily transferred from the Western Front poured a hurricane of fire into the enemy troops. All morning, shells and gunfire rained down on the Red Army, blunting the assault. By dusk, the Russians, savagely mauled by the attack, fell back. It seemed the Red Army had underestimated the strength and determination of their enemy. By the next day, the Russians had still not breached the German defenses. But General Zhukov, with total disregard of casualties, was determined to batter the enemy into submission and ruthlessly bulldoze his way through. Slowly and systematically, the Red Army began smashing through their opponents. Within hours, hard-pressed and exhausted German troops were feeling the full brunt of the assault. Confusion soon swept the decimated lines. Soldiers who had fought doggedly from one fixed position to another were now seized with panic. In 3 days of constant fighting, thousands of German soldiers perished. Despite their attempts to blunt the Red Army, the road to Berlin was finally wrenched wide open. At this crucial moment, a number of top-quality SS soldiers had been gathered in the recently established 11th Panzer Division under the command of SS General Felix Steiner. The 11th Panzer Division had been given the senseless task of launching an offensive designed to dislocate the threatened enemy advance on Berlin, but had been halted against massive attacks. When the final push on Berlin begun on the 16th of April, the 11th Panzer Division retained only 3 reliable divisions. Adolf Hitler famously claimed until the end of his life that Steiner would be able to halt the Russian advance any time. It is unknown if he was so detached from reality that he could not fathom the fact that Steiner's division was destroyed, or that he was given erroneous information by his accolades. But the truth is that Steiner's victory never happened. However, Hitler's faith in the Luftwaffe had been lost, and when the Soviet bombardment of Berlin started in late April, his instinctive reaction was to blame the Luftwaffe for allowing this to happen. He threatened General Koller with execution, not for the first time. The fact that the Luftwaffe had few serviceable aircraft left and even less aviation fuel did not concern him. Anger, he was convinced, lent him inspiration. The Soviet attempt to encircle the city from the north exposed their right flank. He would order a counterattack and cut them to ribbons. He claimed that General Steiner, northwest of Eberswald, would be able to move all his troops to the Soviet right flank and strike the killing blow. When he asked for more details on the situation of Steiner's troops, he was informed that all Steiner had left were 3 battalions and a few tanks. But he refused to acknowledge this. Hitler, oblivious of reality, began claiming that Steiner and his army detachment were the Nazis' secret weapon to finally push the Soviets back. Steiner, when he received the telephone call from the Furher bunker, was dumbfounded by Hitler's order to attack. After collecting his thoughts, he rang General Hans Krebs back to remind him of the true situation, but Krebs was standing almost next to Hitler. By then it was too late. Steiner received an official order to launch a counterattack against the right flank of the First Belarusian Front. He and his officers were also threatened with execution if they failed to obey. Trying to talk sense into Hitler, Steiner's immediate superior rang the Reich Chancellery to protest at this lunacy. Krebs told him that the decision had been made and that he could not speak to the Führer, who was too busy to talk to him. Hitler, during the course of that night of madness, also sacked General Reimann as commander for the defense of Berlin. He became convinced that Reimann was a traitor and was not doing his best to defend the city, and Joseph Goebbels had also received the Führer's hate ever since he refused to move his headquarters into the Zoo bunker alongside his own as Reich Commissioner for the defense of Berlin. 2 replacements were considered and rejected. Berlin was without a commander just as the Red Army was entering the suburbs. It was really the end for Hitler and his 1,000-year Reich. Berlin turns red, the Soviet occupation of the Reich's capital. Despite all of Hitler's wishful thinking, there was nothing he or his generals could do to stop the Red Army from occupying Berlin sooner or later. Still, during the last days before the inevitable happened, Hitler was constantly giving orders to all of his subordinates. Generally, the crux of these orders was to fight until the bitter end, with complete disregard from the soldiers' lives. On 15th April, Hitler sent an order of the day directly to the Ninth Army's headquarters to appeal to the soldiers to stand fast. What the Führer was actually requesting was for every man to fight to the death. However, within a few days of Hitler's stand-fast order, the Red Army had broken through in 2 places and began approaching Berlin. The Ninth Army got stuck between the 2 massive Russian pincers that were heading for the capital. Losses for the Germans were huge, and Theodor Busse, head of the army group Vistula, was facing a major catastrophe, but he was determined to follow his Führer's orders and still did not consider pulling back. Retreat, except under orders, was comparable to treason. Hitler's orders were to stand fast at all costs. With the Ninth Army denied any freedom of movement, it was certain to be destroyed. Despite constant appeals from commanders in the field to act now in order to save the Ninth Army from complete destruction, Hitler's stubborn hold order remained the same. From the Führer headquarters, which was now entombed 60 feet below the ravaged streets of Berlin, a message was sent to Busse, sealing the fate of his army. The Ninth Army must hold its position. By 22nd April, Busse's force was almost encircled and close to annihilation. In spite of orders from Hitler's headquarters that the line of defense of the order must never be abandoned, Busse, with the larger half of the Ninth Army comprising of some 80,000 troops, began to withdraw southwestwards towards the Spreewald in an attempt to link up with the 12th Army. However, it was too late. Within days, the Ninth Army, still doggedly battling towards Spreewald, were totally surrounded and being hammered night and day by Russian bombers. It did not take long before the entire northern flank of the army collapsed. The remnants of the army then shuffled along roads, tracks, and fields trying to escape the slaughter. During their tortuous journey, the exhausted troops moved into a forest near the large village of Halbe. It was here that remnants of the Ninth Army would endure what most of the survivors called the slaughter of Halbe. North of the forest, as Busse's forces tried in vain to stave off destruction inside the Halbe forest, Fighting increased as Soviet forces closed on Berlin. By 25 April, Berlin was completely surrounded, and the next day, some 500,000 Soviet troops bulldozed their way through the city. Beneath the Reich Chancellery building, the Führer was determined to save the crumbling capital and had already ordered remnants of Steiner's 11th Panzer Division to attack immediately from their positions in the Eberswalde, then to drive south, cutting off the Russian assault on Berlin. On Hitler's map, the plan looked brilliant, but it was impossible to gather forces to make Steiner's army even remotely operational. Steiner himself wrote that the forces at his disposal were not actually an army and amounted to less than a weak corps. He was well aware that his attack would receive little or no support, as the 9th Army was completely surrounded, and the 12th Army consisted only of a few battered divisions. As for Hitler's reinforcements, they consisted of fewer than 5,000 Luftwaffe personnel and Hitler Youth, all armed with handheld weapons. The city was doomed. For the next week, the battle for Berlin raged. True to their motto, "My honor is my loyalty," the SS fighting groups were seen fighting bitterly with members of the Hitler Youth, the Luftwaffe, and the German army. Here, the soldiers were ordered to fight to the death, and anyone found deserting or shirking from their duties was hunted down by Heinrich Himmler's personal escort battalion and hanged from the nearest lamppost. But even in the last days of the war, both the German army and the SS proved to be an efficient, formidable, and ruthless fighting machine. Even as the last hours were fought out in the fiery cauldron of Berlin, German units, lacking all provisions including many types of weapons, effectively halted and stemmed a number of Russian assaults. Throughout the final days of the Reich, Hitler was obsessed with the belief that fanatical aggression could win victories. In a number of areas, his hardline strategy actually worked, but at a huge cost in men and material. Nevertheless, the hard-pressed battles fought in front of the capital essentially slowed the Russian drive and tied down an immeasurable amount of men and armor. It also prevented much of the Soviet army from reaching the Baltic Sea, which the Germans believed would seriously curtail the submarine training program. The Baltic Sea had also been used throughout the war to ferry vital supplies to Army Group North, and without this important supply, artery operations would have seriously been hampered. In the last days of the Reich, it also had another source of importance, as it was from the Baltic ports that many Nazi higher-ups fled the country to escape the revenge of the Allies, many landing in South American countries such as Brazil and Argentina. Hitler made it clear that it was imperative that the troops held the front and wage a static battle of attrition until other parts of the Russian front could be stabilized. Slowly and systematically, the Soviet army ground down the Germans, forcing its army to withdraw deeper into the Reich and fight a determined defense wherever it could. When the last German troops were finally expunged from Russian and Baltic soil, the Red Army hailed themselves as the conquerors of fascism. Now they had to drive into Germany and take Berlin. The battle for the Reich capital was a massive undertaking for the Russians, and the loss of life on both sides was immense. There are no exact casualty figures, but it is reckoned that some 1 million men were killed and wounded just in April alone. Soon Soviet tanks were attacking the remains of the Müncheberg Panzer Division on Tempelhof Aerodrome in the middle of Berlin, amid the wrecked fuselages of Focke-Wulf fighters. The battle for Tempelhof Aerodrome continued for 2 days, with Soviet artillery and Katyusha rocket launchers blasting the administrative buildings. Inside, the corridors echoed with the screams of the wounded and were filled with smoke and the smell of burning chemicals. The silence which followed the end of a bombardment was a prelude to the roar of engines and rattle of tracks which announced a new tank attack. With the fall of Berlin imminent, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force forwarded a request to Moscow that day. General Eisenhower desired to send a minimum of 23 Allied accredited war correspondents to Berlin following the capture of the city by the Red Army, as he knew the fall of Berlin would be one of the world's greatest news events. There was no reply from the Kremlin. Stalin clearly did not want any journalists in Berlin, particularly the uncontrollable Western variety. With May Day, the most important celebration in the Soviet Union, quickly approaching, he ordered General Zhukov to enter Berlin as quickly as possible in order to fly the red flag on top of the Reichstag by May 1st. It would take them just a little longer than that. Following the surrender of Berlin on the 2nd of May 1945, The will to fight of the remaining forces still attempting to defend parts of eastern Germany, notably the scattered remnants of what was left of Army Group Vistula, quickly came to an end. Hitler had taken his own life and his wife's, as did Himmler and some of the top Nazis in the capital. It was all over for the Third Reich. With Hitler dead, most of his collaborators either imprisoned, dead or en route to exotic regions of the world, the people of Berlin were left defenseless. Slowly they began to climb out of their ruined cellars and the subway tunnels where they had hidden from the bombs. Now, it was their turn to hide from the vicious attacks from the occupying soldiers, but at least the bombing was over. Berliners were seized by a mixture of hope and despair, and nobody knew what the future would bring. Not even the Soviet soldiers could imagine that for the next half a century, the once vibrant city of Berlin would be rebuilt from its ashes by the victors, only to have it cut in half with detachments of police and military guarding the border. But no matter whether they ended up in West or East Berlin, the citizens of Berlin would never forget the horrors they went through during those harrowing months of 1945.